Sorry, I am having difficulties with the screen. Okay, let's go anyway. Let's forget about the pictures. As I was saying, on October 15, 1980, I visited WIFA. I entered the building on Market Street. Professor Klein was leaving for his class that morning. I greeted him and he asked me for his former students in Mexico, and I walked into the building. He left for the class. On the third floor, a friend asked me, "Do you know the good news?" And I felt myself an insect. I was not aware that morning he had been waken up by the call from the Nobel Committee. I mean, I feel, as I said, myself an insect. But he smiled, he was kind as he was always, and later that morning at the pen, we had the gathering for him that morning. He visited Costa Rica 4 times. He opened Econometric Society meeting with 3 other Nobel laureates. The same happened with LACEA, which is a Latin American meeting of economists. And he was always nice to the students and to all of us. We will always miss his kind smile, but his teaching will always be with us. Welcome to Costa Rica, and let's, with no more mistake, hopefully, carry on. Bobby, please. No, Peter, sorry.
Okay, then I will. Raphael, I think we're very grateful to you for bringing us together on this day. It's a shame that it has to be a Zoom meeting and not in person, but it's actually quite apropos. I don't know whether many of you know that Larry Klein organized the first set of international teleconference forecasting meetings in the early 1980s. So this is kind of in his spirit, if you will. I think it's important for us to think back on Larry and why we all admired him. He, of course, was an outstanding academic. He got all the accolades and academic recognition in the world. But in that, I think he achieved what he wanted by being a very particular person. He achieved what he had with academic excellence, perseverance, integrity, honesty, and what's particularly important, with humility. And I think leadership and outstanding individuals in our field have to be have to show some humility. I've met a fairly large number of great economists. Quite a few of them, as you know, are jerks, but Larry never was. He received the recognition and the devotion that he received from his colleagues, his students, all his friends, because he was a deeply caring and humble personality. He had an impact on so many economic fields. He's the godfather of applied econometrics. He started econometric modeling. I think this biggest impact on us that we're assembled here today was as an individual. And I think he and Sonia traveled the world as ambassadors of science, as ambassadors of leadership, and as ambassadors of friendship. He brought together in Philadelphia, I mean, you all have some connection with Philadelphia. At a time it was the center of the modeling universe. He brought together students from all over the world, scholars from all over the world, to work on his ideas and to work with him. And he brought to his travels econometric modeling to the world. So he was really a global presence. He was important for the establishment of the field, and he was important for many of our academic and human developments. So I think we all are deeply indebted to him and Sonia, and I think we'll hear many more testimonials a little later. But what we have to do is we have a number of presentations that actually are very much aligned with him and his work. Do we have Larry Lau around?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Larry, how are
Just
you?
got in.
Okay, good. So you're first on the list. You are, of course, a long friend and colleague of Laurie's. And I think what you're going to talk about is very much along the lines of what his was, to analyze problems that are global, that are international, that affect everybody. And what you're talking about, trade and COVID, I think is very much along the lines. So I hand it over to you.
1 minute. It seems like I still sharing my screen, so I need to get out of that, and I'm not exactly sure how I should do that.
Okay. Can I get my, thank you, Peter.
You can start talking in a minute. I should be in. Oh, please go ahead and while I struggle with Zoom.
Okay. I will. Could you see the screen?
Good.
Ah, okay, great. So it works. Okay. Thank you, Peter. And I very much agree with Peter that Laurie is really a giant in the field of econometrics. My first exposure to Laurie was through Klein Model 1. I think very few people know about Klein Model 1 now, but it is the first econometric model built on the basis of simultaneous equations. And from that, Laurie went on to develop the Klein-Goldberger model, and then the Weaver model, and then, of course, Project Link, which brought all of us together. I consider Laurie my mentor and advisor and a very dear friend. And I think we truly miss him. And I think Peter was absolutely right that we really ought to be using Project Link to study the effect of the trade war as well as COVID-19 on the world. I hope that the United Nations team that took over Project Link should be doing that, because they're really a great application. Let me first of all say that the trade war between China and the US actually started in January of 2018, even though the first tariffs did not really take effect until mid-2018. It's still ongoing. despite a truce in the form of a phase one agreement. The average US tariff rate on Chinese exports to the US went from 3.1% in January 2018 to close to 20% today, by March 2020. So, but the Chinese exporters really don't have that kind of a margin. So that means many of the tariffs have been prohibitive. Now, but even though the tariffs did not become effective until mid-2018, they were actually anticipated and they had an effect on Chinese export orders. So the rate of growth of the Chinese economy declined from 6.9% in 2017 to 6.7% in 2018, and then to 6.0% in 2019, a total reduction of about 0.8%. And if you use quarterly rates, it's about the same, about 0.9%. The declines may be largely attributed to the China-US trade war, but the trade war caused a very, very slight decline in the rate of growth of the US economy. And you will see I have a simple explanation why this is the case. Now, the first effects actually hit the stock markets. I'll just show you this chart. And you can see that the green line on top is the S&P index. And you see the trade war had very little effect on the SP index. In fact, it went to a new high by early 2020. The red line is the Hong Kong stock market. And then the yellow, the gray line, were the Shenzhen and Shanghai stock market. You can see that they really took a hit from the trade war. But by now, actually, the Shenzhen stock market, as well as S&P, they have actually recovered and about 30% above the base level in 2018. Shanghai is about even. Hong Kong is about 20% down. The first COVID-19 case in China was actually found in Wuhan, in Hubei, in December 2019. And basically, China actually overall has managed the epidemic quite well. It imposed a blockade of Wuhan and Hubei on 23rd January 2020. Basically, no traffic, no airlines, no trains, no highway traffic, no water traffic was allowed into Hubei. And it turned out to be extremely effective, as you'll see later from the numbers. By 31st August, which was about a couple of weeks ago, the total cases on the mainland was about 85,000. Total deaths is about 4,600. But the bulk of it was found in Hubei, the province that was being blockaded, and they had 68,000 cases and 4,500 deaths. So you can see that outside of Hubei province, the rest of China, only 17,000 cases and 122 deaths, with a population of 13.4 billion. And you can see it really has been successful, because otherwise, there would have been many, many more cases in a large country like China. So we should be thankful that China decided to order a blockade and a lockdown. But the COVID-19 epidemic lowered the year-over-year growth rates in China. For 2020 Q1, first quarter, it was expected to be around 6%, but actually the growth rate was minus 6.8% year over year. And the second quarter was, miraculously was a recovery to a positive growth of 3.2%, also year over year. So it's actually not too bad. For the year as a whole, my prediction was that it would be growing at 3.4% for the year as a whole, compared to expected 6% growth rate on average. So there's a reduction of 2.6%, about that order. The first case was actually in the US, was actually reported, I think in late January 2020. I think, unfortunately, the US did not handle the epidemic too well. As of 31st August, the US had more than 6.17 million cases. I think it's now getting close to 7 million now. And then today, I guess it is almost close to 200,000 deaths. You know, and this is a huge number compared to the cumulative cases and deaths in China. The COVID-19 epidemic has resulted in a projected contraction of the US of more than 5%, more than 5%. My own projection is about contraction of 5.7%, but it doesn't matter, it's a large contraction. And if you figure that the US should have grown around 3%, and you say that the loss of GDP overall would be around 8%, okay? And the other thing that the trade war and the COVID-19 epidemic have done is it caused a deterioration of China-US relations to probably the lowest point since 1971. Okay, now first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the Chinese exports and imports. This shows the exports and imports in China from 1960 to 2019. And you could see that at first, before the reform and opening in China in 1978, there was almost nothing, you know, very few exports and very little imports. But then it rose very quickly and it reached a peak of around 35% of GDP exports, right? And around 2006, 2007, there was 3%. And it began to come down again. And it is now actually, it's come down to around 20%, okay? Which is more, a little bit more reasonable. If you now look at exports of goods and services and goods alone, the red line is exports of goods and services. The blue line is exports of goods only. Now, the reason I distinguish the two is because tariffs only apply to goods. The tariffs do not apply to services. So you should look at the blue line. The blue line basically says that the exports as a percent, total exports to the world as a percent of GDP of goods is around 17, 18%. Now, but what about to the US? To the US, actually, it reached a peak of about almost 7% in 2007, but by 2019, it is down to around 3%, all right? Now, the way to think about this is this: if exports is only 7% of GDP, so if all exports from China to the US, if all exports are terminated, what would be the maximum damage? The maximum damage would be 3%. But not everything, not all exports. The gross value is very different from value added. The value added of Chinese exports to the US, the direct value added is around 25%. Okay, but if you think about that, the reduction in exports to the US would cause a reduction in income as well as reductions of the derived demand for inputs in China. There would be a second round effect, and then there would be a third and fourth round effect. If you add all of it together, the sum of the direct and indirect effects will come to around 66%. So the value added is 66%. So if you take 66% and you multiply by 3%, this tells you that if exports were terminated altogether, it would cause a loss of GDP around 2%. So that's just a rough calculation. But if half of the exports were lost, it would cause a contraction of 1%. Now, of course, the next thing we're going to look at is look at the US. US dependence on exports is even lower than China. Okay, it is around 12% for goods and services and only around 8% for goods alone. Okay, so US exports to China of services is actually, goods and services together is actually less than 1%, but goods alone is actually only about 0.5%. All right, so Now, the next thing we want to look at, of course, is what is the value added of US exports to China. All right. Now, it turns out that the US export to China, actually, they have a higher value added. The direct value added is around 50%. If you add in all the indirect value added, the total is around 88.7%. All right. This is all calculated from an input-output table. Now, if you apply 88.7% times 0.5%, because exports is only from US to China is only about 0.5%, that means the reduction is around 0.44% of GDP. So you can see actually that the impact of the trade war actually is much greater on China than on the US. You know, both as a percentage GDP, but also absolutely if you multiply the GDP. GDP of the US is about 21 trillion. GDP of China is about 14 trillion. So you can do the calculation. All right, now, so this is basically what I can say about the trade war, is that it will do more damage to China than the US. But the damage is actually, if you think about only about half of exports have been terminated, then it is about 1% for China and about 0.22% for the US. Okay. Now, so this is just a chart summarizing what happens. If you have 50%, then this is what happens to the reduction of GDP. If you're 100%, then you can see. But they are actually, by and large, quite limited and actually very small as far as US is concerned, a little bit more significant for China. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk about is the COVID-19, okay? Now, what I have plotted here is the cumulative number of cases. The red line is China, and the blue line is the United States. Now, the scale is logarithmic, okay? So that's why you can put everything together. China actually has essentially controlled the epidemic. So the cumulative number is around 85,000. You can see that hasn't increased very much over time since March. The US line is still rising. You look at the blue line, and it is now getting close to 7 million, okay, you know, over 6 million. The next chart is number of deaths, cumulative number of deaths. Again, China has about 4,600, and the US is actually getting close to 200,000. All right, so it's a huge difference in terms of the impact of the epidemic. Now, among the G7 countries, you know, G7, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US, and the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, we did some calculations, comparisons, and it turns out that the population infection rate of China is about 61 per million, okay? And the death rate is very low, is 3.3 per million. The US actually is really very high. The population infection rate was 18,000, almost 19,000. This is as of August 31st. The death rate is about 569 per million. Also, you know, really very high, but it's actually not that high. It's high compared to China, not that high compared to some other countries. And this I will show you. This is the population infection rate. China, as you can hardly see, is the third one from the left. But you can see that the US is very high, but Brazil is also very high. And in fact, you know, if I had more recent data, Brazil would have been even higher. But so UK is not too low, and South Africa is quite high and so forth. But the next thing you can look at would be the death rate. You can see that in fact, the mortality rate actually is probably the highest in the UK. Okay, you know, the brown line. But it's very, very high in Italy, and very high in Brazil, and the US is really comparable. You know, it's only relative to China and Japan and maybe Korea that these rates of the other countries seem very, very high. Okay, now what about the cost of pandemic to China and US? And if you look at the loss of GDP, which I calculated by looking at the hypothetical GDP, what GDP would have been without the COVID-19 epidemic, and what actual GDP would be like, and also projected. And we could see that in China, the percent of GDP loss is around 3.5%. And that's about $500 billion. With the US, the loss is much bigger because it would have grown 3%. It's now going to be contracting by more than 5%. So that gives you actually a 1.8 trillion. So it's much bigger loss of GDP. And similarly, in terms of loss of life, actually much bigger in terms in the US. Now, near term, I have actually collected some projections and different projections, my own projections on the left, and the IMF, World Bank, OECD, US Investment Bank, I shouldn't mention its name. But you could see that that I'm not the most optimistic. I'm also not the most pessimistic, all right, but around middle. And I think what is really interesting is to look at 2020 and 2021 combined, because what happens if you go down much more in 2020 and you will recover at a higher rate in 2021 and vice versa. So you look at the sum, they really don't differ enormously across the different projections. But I think what is more interesting would be the projections of my own projections for the future. But I want to actually say one thing, and that is that in some sense, China has actually been growing way too fast. And that is really why that made the US so suspicious and so sensitive. If you look at this chart, the blue line is the US GDP, the red line is the Chinese GDP in 2019 prices. And in 1978, Chinese GDP was only 5% of US GDP. In 2000, the year that China entered WTO, it was less than 20%. Okay, by 2019, it's about 66%. It's about 2/3. So it's really gone up, catching up very fast. And now, one thing I want to show you is this chart, and which shows that, which has the Japanese growth rates, the Chinese growth rate in red, Japanese growth rate in yellow, and the US growth rate in blue. On the vertical axis is the rate of growth. On the horizontal axis is the per capita real GDP. Now, it is an empirical regularity that as the per capita real GDP rises, the rate of growth would fall, okay? And this is quite clearly looking at the scatter diagram. There are many reasons, we don't have time to go into it, but in any case, what I want to point out is that China today is at around 10,000 US dollars per capita, okay? So if you actually believe in this chart, then China still has quite a few years, a decade or two, to grow at a fast rate, okay? You know, and say between 5 and 6%. And the US, which is already over 60,000, would have a much harder time. Cannot possibly go that fast. My assumption it will continue to grow at around 3%, okay? Which is basically the average rate of growth over the past 2-3 decades, all right? So if you use these numbers and do the projection, and you can see the columns are the rates of growth and the lines are the GDP growth. You can see that the two lines will just cross around 2030. Okay, so I mean this is just a projection. So it could be 2 years plus or minus a couple of years. We don't know, but the chances are that the Chinese aggregate GDP will catch up with the U.S. GDP in the 10 years, maybe 15 years. If it takes longer, maybe 8 years or shorter. But it will, over this period, it will actually, in terms of aggregate, will take over. Now, but in terms of per capita, though, it is still very, very low. Even if you look at 2030, US GDP per capita would be over $80,000 in 2019 prices. Chinese GDP per capita will still be below 20,000 per capita. Okay, so in terms of per capita, it's a long time. And my own personal prediction is that for Chinese GDP per capita to catch up to US GDP per capita, it will take until the end of the century, if ever. I think it's actually possible that Chinese GDP per capita will never catch up to US GDP per capita because the US is much better endowed in terms of land, water, mineral resources, and so forth. So anyhow, now I just have one more slide and then I will stop. I think the timing is just right. I think the interesting thing, though, I want to say is that the economic impacts of both the China-US trade war and the COVID-19 epidemic actually extend far beyond China and the US. And there are not only direct effects, but there are indirect effects. For example, US tariffs on Chinese exports would increase Vietnamese exports to the US, which is already happening. And then Chinese tariffs on US exports may increase Brazilian exports of agricultural products, soybeans, whether it's beef and so forth, to China. So I think it is really an ideal situation for the Project Link to look at this, took a close look at this, because both aggregate supply and aggregate demand in all countries will be affected. Okay, supply chain and so forth. So what I hope is that our UN colleagues that took over Project Link would be working on this. I know that if this happened 20 years ago, Peter would be working on it. But now we hope that the new team would work on it. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here to speak about Laurie, and I think Laurie would be very happy to see that the Project Link can be applied to these results. Thank you. Can I hear you, Peter? Are you okay? Good.
Okay, now you can. Can you now?
Huh?
You hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much, Larry. We're running a little bit behind, but if anybody wants to add an observation to this, please do. As Larry pointed out, clearly this is something that is ideal to be analyzed for a global model. We're not in that position right now, but I'm sure most other international organizations work on it as we speak. Any comments?
Yes, Peter, Alfredo Coutinho.
Okay, go ahead.
Professor Law, it seems that one of the main issues for this economy for the medium term, it's basically the switch of fixed and to consumption. So when we see what is happening with the ICOR, the investment GDP ratio for the next 5 years, it seems that that is decreasing. so it has a decreasing trend, basically because of two factors. The first one is because of the switch in the sources of growth from investment to consumption. And the second one is, it seems to me that China has been losing attractiveness to international investors. So that explains also why the investment ratio will continue to decrease in coming years. So based on a growth model, so based on the investment output ratio, so we can see that the Chinese economy will continue to lose production capacity in the medium term. What are your comments about that? Is this true? Is this something that you can explore with your projections and models?
Actually, China has too much investment. It's not too little. If you actually look at the ratio of foreign direct investment to gross domestic investment, it was at one time, maybe in the 90s, would be as high as 14%. It's now actually down to 3%. It's not important. Foreign direct investment is no longer an important factor in China, all right, because Chinese investment is so high. Now, it is also true that China invests too much. If you look at the investment to GDP ratio for the last 10 years, it's over 40%. You know, and I think when you invest that much, you know some of it will turn out not to be efficient investments, all right? But I think everybody, I mean, most people think that China is now an economy with excess capacity. You know, the constraints is not from the supply side. The constraints are on the demand side. So, so I think that actually might be a slightly more useful way of looking at what's happening. Thank you.
Well, Larry, thank you very much for doing this. I know it's late in the evening where you are, so thank you very much. Let's move on. Suleiman, you've been working with Larry for a long, long time, and I think you want to share your experience of working with him and what has guided his research in the area. So go ahead.
Unmute and then share my screen. Do you see my screen?
No.
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
If it's needed, I can ask Professor Sirinash.
Now, how about now?
Okay.
Now, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. So it's an actually honor to be here talking about Lawrence Klein, who was a mentor and a very good friend to all of us. This is a joint paper with Professor Mariano. It's a longer paper. This is the one part of it. So when we started writing it, we thought, okay, now there are other parts which comes out. So can we make another shorter paper just on the philosophy on modeling, nowcasting, and forecasting? And that's what I will present today. So we'll basically talk about first, we actually argue that Klein is probably the real expert on nowcasting and real-time forecasting. And we also say that whatever he did before, all the principles he put forward or told us are actually much more relevant today. There are many papers and books reviewing his work. We had some of them here. Some of them are already in the audience. But today we will concentrate on just the principles that we observed and we can all learn from. So first, what we'll do is clarify certain things, because in the title we say, you know, the guidelines on nowcasting, forecasting, but Klein never talked about nowcasting. So we have to see how this actually ties to that whole forecasting exercise. So first we will clarify some of the definitions, and then we'll talk about his guiding principles. We tried to collect them into, well, we collected them into 9 groups, and we like to hear all of your comments on those. And if you like to add anything, that we missed something, we'll be happy to hear those. So first, the term nowcasting or nowcast, that's a term which is used in weather forecasting for a very long time. And that refers to like the forecast from 0 to 6 hours. So if you want to forecast, let's say it's going to rain in Costa Rica in 2 hours, that's like a nowcast. So that's the basic definition which economists borrowed. And with station index, we saw that in 2005 was the first time it was used in the title. It may be used in working papers and other discussions, but basically that was in a social science citation index. So the most common use is, or the definition is this one, by Giannini, Bickley, and Small. Nowcasting is the prediction of present, the very near future, and the very recent past in economics. So we will talk about this first, and we think it is incomplete, and this is the reason. So normally when we talk about forecasting, we talk about the data point. So if we have data for August for employment, and we get the forecast for September, then that's basically a forecast, according to Klein and according to all of us. Data point is last data point. Anything after estimation, anything we estimate or predict after that is forecast. And the Box-Jenkins book, anything before the first point is like backcasting. He used backcasting, forecasting, but they didn't use nowcasting. Now, since it's nowcasting, and it refers to something like related to not only the data point, but also the time that you make the estimation. So then if that is the case, and if your model has all the stock prices, exchange rates, that is basically real-time data, minute by minute, then you have to estimate that model every second, literally. Otherwise, you have just one forecast, and that's not nowcast. When you say nowcast, it has to be different than forecasting for the next month. It has to be for this month, and it has to be repeated estimations to get as many forecasts as the number of releases by officials. And so if you don't have something like the continuous re-estimation in a definition, then we think it's not complete. It should include that, and actually it should be the practice of that. That's what Klein practiced, and we will talk about that in the guiding section. So that's continuous re-estimation, and we also know that if you estimate it like for the link project twice, that experience is very different than doing those estimations once a week. You come across with very different problems and very different, well, higher frequencies. So that's one thing that we have to clarify. Klein never used the term nowcast, and the term which is becoming popular as nowcast, we use it in the title because Klein actually was the person who did that, what is called nowcasting today, but nobody knows about that. So that's why we have that in the title also. because that's what Klein did for the last 30 years of his life. So he did the term current quarter, and today that it's used nowcasting. And as Mazi and Canada, they say that, you know, statistical offices, they may all have different definitions, but fortunately, the Atlanta Fed had a publication, GDP Now. That is maybe the most referenced people refer to these days as GDP Now as the forecast, and they correctly say that bridge equation and tracking models is basically the creation of Klein. But you don't see it any other, well, many other places. You don't see it all the time. So that's basically to clarify the definition why we have it in the title, although Klein didn't actually use the term. And then we put the guiding philosophy into 9 groups, and then some of them has subgroups. The first thing that we see Klein, as Larry mentioned, that the Klein model 1, Klein always thought that all the issues as interdependent and look at the problem as a system. And then use all available information to understand the structure first, and then use it for forecasting, very short-term forecasting, nowcasting, or long-term. So that was his, basically his research, and also his daily life. You observe that in his daily life also. He looks at all the problems and then tries to solve them. And then basically his contributions come from the fact that he sees as a system. His macroeconomic models are very well known, but his CQM also was a system. It has like about 200 equations for each category of national income accounts, and then you take the sum to come up with in a model, you come up with the sum of those as the GDP, and then you do the same thing for prices, and then you take the ratio to come up with the real side of the economy. And then he actually wrote many times, but the book with welfare is the first chapter actually introduces that concept, like you include all the input-output tables, flow of funds, all Keynesian type of models, and then you come up with a big system. And then obviously if you extend it, he extended to the global economy. So we have the project link. So it's not only one economy, but you have to look at the entire interdependence in the global economy. So you come up with the project link. So the first part is CQM, and that CQM is basically mimicking the GDP accounts of Bureau of Economic Analysis. So the question is, Bureau of Economic Analysis gets some numbers, monthly numbers, but they wait to get the exact calculation for the quarterly numbers. So Klein asked the question, well, if you have some of these numbers, why don't you use them? Why do we have to wait until the end of October, for example, to get the third quarter GDP? If we have some of the monthly numbers, if we have for example, August number for employment, we can use all of them to come up with an estimate for the third quarter GDP. That's basically what CQM is. And what he did was, way BA calculates, just did exactly the same thing, use the same variables in the models, find the relationships, and then get the forecast. And basically that's what I mentioned that. And then what we normally do is GDP for the US is available for the second quarter. It was released on July 30th. So we need to forecast the third quarter. So it's only 2 quarter ahead forecast, 2 quarters forecast, or 6 months. So the first month you will have 6 months, but as you have more data, you will have less number of months to forecast. So in his weekly reports, forecasts for 2000 Q3 and 2000 Q4 will be called forecasts. And he will call the 2000 Q3 forecast as a current quarter because we are in Q3. We are in the third quarter, September, so that will be called current quarter forecast. And then next quarter, fourth quarter will be just a forecast. Now, that current quarter, what Klein used to call current quarter forecast, the third quarter, is called nowcast. There is nothing different. The methods are exactly the same. There is nothing with one maybe that maybe just short-term methods like the box-Jenkins, they are used, or the dynamic factor models, they are used. But in terms of the different methods, there is nothing new, or there is nothing, another method, which is called nowcasting. It's the same method, it just refers to the period that you actually make the forecast. If you are talking about today, if we have the August number, we have the August number. If I do the forecast for September, it's called forecast for Klein. It will be called nowcast for those who call it nowcasting. Because we are in September, if we forecast employment for September, it will be called nowcast. There is nothing different. So what he did do is basically nowcasting, but he didn't use the term. And then for the project link, we all know, we are all probably all from that. That was established 50 years ago, and now more than 100 people knows that system. And the idea is based on that the local economists and econometricians know their economy best. So it's different to sit in, you may be the best econometrician in a World Bank or IMF or the United Nations. It's difficult to get 100, what's happening in 100 different countries and talk about them. As Larry said, more probably than what we know about China than anyone can, because he's there, he's from there. So that's the idea. The starting idea is that the local or the economists in the countries know it better, so why don't we get information from them? Whether it is data, they can get data from statistical offices much easier, or they can get the correct data as opposed to someone in the center trying to get it from there. It's true now also. It was definitely true before that, when we used to get data from, dusted folders of statistical offices. So, I talk about the link model that they are trade metrics, but what is important was Peter used to include all those scenarios, but also there were experiments, or they want to have the financial side and also tourism to have all those linkages. So Link tried to do those, not just by the trade matrix, that was probably the operational one, but there were experiments with tourism. How do we tie all those linkages through tourism and then financial flows, etc. But we didn't, finalize probably all those things. Now we are in a position that maybe last year they had like environment and weather related issues, and maybe now we should have health and others. And as recommended by Larry and speakers before, him suggested that we need some visionaries like Klein, and also some visionaries in the funding side also. It can be United Nations or some others. So Link is probably more important now than ever. And then that's what we summarize it here, that we can talk about modeling virus, and Larry gave good estimates for the virus and then its effect on the death and the growth rate. But there is also the modeling side. In the models, we assume that we know the data processing, data generating process. We assume that we know the population equation, and then we just try to get samples. Well, maybe we have to revise those. We don't maybe know that population equation as we thought we know. Maybe there are some other random things there we have to include. Because when we look at the SARS, MERS, H1N1, and all those things, it's not just one observation. We actually had more than 20 observations during the last 100 years. And then we missed this very badly. And, you know, it's an unfortunate thing, but we probably had to have some idea, like predicting earthquakes. We cannot predict the date or the extent of the damage, but we could have said something, or not us, but some others also in the health forecasting group, that there is something, there may be something happening during next 5 years, something like that. So link type of group may be instrumental in those things. So that was the first idea. Look at the system, but not just one country, but entire world. And then the second thing is obviously use all available information. So whether you have daily, weekly, use all of them, and then in a systematic way, that's what he did, use those in bridge equation, tie variables with different frequencies, and then forecast those. And then he also made very, high use of what it's called soft data, that is survey. So any survey we did, the European survey, we did Michigan, we had a survey corner that can be used, and then also not only Michigan, the headline, but also like all the questions in that, whether one question may tell it more about just the headline.
1 minute.
So, and the third is repeated rapid estimates. So he was keen on CQM, and we released the report once a week, but we actually had more often, we had forecast more often as we needed. So in the paper, we did like a forecast of the interest rates every 10 minutes. So it is possible technically to do it now every second, but normally you have to check your results, etc. That's why we had like 10 minutes intervals. So it is possible to repeat these estimates more often as you want. That he was keen on that because he was saying that if there is structural change, then you may see it in those new estimates with some new data. And then forecast averaging is another thing that we have to do, like all the three methods in the CQM, and then take the average, and that averaging may actually improve the forecast, and that was the case. The fifth is what the replicable model. The one term that maybe I heard from is the model has to be replicable. So Klein model one was, the data and the equations in different methods were published. And that's why we could all, see whether we get the same result or not, check our programs in Fortran. And then he also published the second edition of his lectures in econometrics, the textbook of econometrics Fortran program of matrix operations. This may not be usual thing today, but it wasn't there at the time. So he did that Klein-Goldberger model. Again, the data was published, so other researchers can actually check whether they can get something different or check the dynamic properties of the model, etc. So also data revisions are common in the US. They publish, for example, the first advanced estimate of the NIPA accounts, and then the second estimate and the third estimate. So the question he was asking was, okay, we have the advanced estimate. Can we estimate what the next forecast, next number that BA will release? So we spent a lot of time and then actually did that for several years. We tried to guess what the second and the third estimate will be. So data revisions was something else. And I called it estimations an extreme case. So there were several cases that during my 14, 15 years on weekly report, one was the September 11th. So in our, it is the income side model. There is personal income, and then you add the personal, the capital consumption, etc., to get the GDP. So we had the capital consumption equation, which depended on the past investment, etc. But then you had to forecast it for the third quarter. So the third quarter was going to be not a good forecast, probably. So he said, you know, let's try to get some other information. And he called someone at BA and then got an estimate like 55 billion at the time. I hope I'm not wrong. And so we did like another equation, which has 0 all the way and then 55 for the third quarter and then 0 for the fourth quarter, and keep our original equation and then do the forecast. And then once BA published the third quarter number in end of October, then we just went back to the original model. So he was willing to use any information available that can come from expert and not necessarily from a model. And then, as Peter and Larry mentioned, that he was, humility was one of his actually features. And then he was also an econometrician and an economist. And then he not only used the short-term, but he had long-term model with Klein and Kosovo, and he had a micro model with Rubin 1947. And then his introduction actually has these chapters: demand, cost, income, and wealth, and then trade and cycles. So all three of them are actually can be considered microeconomics. And then he refers to those experts as masters, like masters, Schultz in demand, the Dean is in cost, and then Douglas in production, Pareto in income and wealth, etc. So he calls all of them as masters. And then his thesis was titled Keynesian Revolution. So he was an economist at first, a human being first, and then economist, and then econometrician. And then we have the use all the available software. So when he started CQM, Aremos was the program available to download data and then to do some modeling. But there was nothing ARIMA, or the RETS was used for ARIMA, and there were some experiments with VAR models also. And there was no principal components, and TSP was used for principal components. So all the available programs, he made use of those. And then once the eViews had all those programs, we slowly moved everything to eViews. So the conclusion, we have three of them, and then one is, as Peter and Larry mentioned, that he had a lot of impact on the World Econometric Society, to all the who are interested in econometric. He helped every single one of us. And then we say that, you know, the compare it with Alexander Graham Bell's first telephone and the cell phone that we have today. We can talk to each other from one part of the world to the other. And now we have high quality modeling efforts with all the computing power and data available. But they owe a lot to the first model builders, Klein and Timbergen and others in the group. And then also, there are probably millions of research papers and books that already assumes that the world is round and gravity is given. So they are already accepted by everyone. And Klein is probably similar in that sense to econometricians. There may be econometricians who are doing research using his work without knowing his work or without knowing even his name, unfortunately, but that may be the case. So those are the conclusions, and we first thank to Professor Klein for being a mentor and dependable friend, and we are grateful to him to owe him a lot. We all know that, and even in his absence, he helped us to think about these most important issues of today, whether it is modeling or whether it is COVID, etc. And then with the help of our friends at Costa Rica, they gave us an opportunity to discuss these issues. So even in his absence, he made us do some work. And we also obviously thank to Juan Vargas and organizers in Costa Rica and other participants who made this celebration a reality, memorable reality. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Suleiman. If I may just add one observation, because I think this is kind of leading to it, and that is the question. I mean, what's the role of econometric modeling in a world of artificial intelligence and machine learning? And my answer to that is it's probably on the side of structural modeling that is replicable, that is interpretable, that has some causal implications, and not necessarily on the forecasting side. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, actually, if this is the paper, the shorter paper, but the longer paper has the title that you just mentioned. It's not ready yet, but hopefully it will be ready at the end of the month if I can.
Yeah.
If it comes out here.
Does anybody else wants to comment?
Yeah, this is the title, Peter.
Yeah.
The big long paper is Lawrence Klein Principles in Modeling and Contributions in Nowcasting, Real-Time Forecasting, and Machine Learning. So
Yeah.
what I described is basically a part of this bigger picture. And definitely we talk about that machine learning, they are, you know, it's very fast developing field. And the regressions is one method they use. Principal components is another method they use. And Klein used them before machine learning was actually came about. So we try to relate all those. Obviously, Klein didn't write in a journal in machine learning, but the techniques that he used, he applied, were definitely similar to what they use in machine learning and computational statistics.
Okay, do we want to move on? Bobby, are you ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay. I mean, you've been
get my slides in. Let me see.
Okay, you've been working on this for a long while.
That's right. And actually, this presentation is a follow-up on the chapter that appeared in your volume in 2018.
Yeah.
Let me put on my slides. Share. There we go. So here's the topic of my talk, and this is based on ongoing joint research with with Suleiman and myself at Penn. First of all, special thanks to Juan Rafael and the University of Costa Rica for organizing this special conference. Today I will talk about a long-time popular research issue in the econometric statistical literature, combining mixed frequency data for timely forecast updates in a time series context. The econometric issue of combining mixed frequency data for short-term forecasting was a research area of extreme interest to Lawrence Klein. In the context of macroeconometric models, his works on this topic started over 30 years ago, as reported in his presentations in international meetings since the 1980s, and continued through to his dying days through his weekly reports on updated forecasts from his CQM model of the US economy, which he worked on with Suleiman. I will be talking about a dozen methods and comparing the accuracy, predictive accuracy of these methods in coping with mixed frequency data. And by now, all the methods that we consider are commonly used in current econometric forecasting environments, but new variations keep sprouting as new needs and new data types emerge. And as I mentioned, this study follows up on the research work with preliminary results reported in Chapter 1 in Peter's Volume 18 in honor of Laurie Klein. So the main objective here in this study is to assess the relative predictive accuracy of alternative mixed frequency forecasting methods. In particular, when applied to the Philippine case and in short-term forecasting of inflation, GDP growth, and other related macroeconomic variables. The paper focuses on variations of two alternative classes of models that deal with, quotes, missing observations in the mixed frequency data set. One group is the dynamic latent factor models, or DFM for short. And the second group is the mixed data sampling, or MIDAS regression. DFM is parsimonious, dependent on a much smaller data set that needs to be updated regularly, but technically and computationally more complicated. On the other hand, MIDAS is data intensive, but computationally more tractable. And in the case of DFM, the additional feature of unobserved common factors introduces even more complications, especially in deriving the appropriate observable state space formulation of the model, as this is idiosyncratic to the specific profile of the mixed frequencies in the data, and actually gets more and more demanding as the frequency model gets higher and higher. For now, suppose we have only monthly and quarterly data in our sample and stack each variable data into a column of monthly observations so that we're dealing with the higher frequency of the two. Quarterly variables like GDP and the implicit price deflator, PGDP, have missing observations in the columns. The first 2 months of each quarter is a blank. If all data are available, techniques for estimation and simulation of the models have already been around for a long while and can be solved by Kalman filtering, etc. But complications arise when, as in this case, some observations are periodically missing. DFM and MIDAS deal with this problem in two different fashions, as can be seen when you look at the details. I don't have time to go to the slides that I prepared to give you some additional information, but more details are provided in the complete paper that accompanies these slides. Here's a listing of the alternative forecasting models that we will be analyzing in our nowcasting forecasting models. So these are the first two are variations of the dynamic factor model. And then 2, 3, 4, 5 are variations of, 3, 4, 5, and others are variations of the MIDAS. 9 combines or looks at the CQM approach using bridge equations. And number 10 deals with the potential of combining forecasts. In terms of, as I said, I'm going to skip the details in the interest of saving time. And for the combination of forecasts, weighted average of forecasts from the competing models are also considered to improve forecast accuracy. And the alternative averaging schemes that we consider in this study are listed here. The mean of the forecasts at time t, the median, weights are a weighted average using weights based on mean square errors or based on the MSE ranks. And last but not least, weights from least squares regression of actual observations on the forecast at time t. The database that we deal with includes mixed frequency data that are daily, monthly, quarterly over the period 1999 to 2019. And the target variables to be forecasted are 6. Quarterly GDP and GDP implicit price deflator, and then monthly CPI, Industrial Production Index, and Merchandise Exports and Producer Price Index. All variables are expressed in year-on-year growth. The 60 indicator variables are grouped as follows: the real sector, financial monetary sector, etc. The sources are from the Philippines, the Philippine Statistics Authority, the Central Bank of the Philippines, and other sources in the US and international, the IMF, the US Fed, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, FRED, and OECD. The expectation survey data conducted collected by the Central Bank in the Philippines, the Bangko Sentral Pilipinas, BSP, has enough of a series that we're able to use it and consider it as potential indicators for the forecasting exercise. And the methodology is to first calculate the summary measures of prediction performance. And we look predominantly on the mean absolute error instead of percentage errors, since we're dealing with year-on-year changes. We first estimate the forecasting methods using the forecasting methods in the comparison pool and calculate the forecast errors over the sample period. We apply statistical tests of comparative predictive accuracy, one for binary comparisons using the DM or Diebold-Mariano test, and then the generalization of it is utilized to compare 3 or more forecasting methods. These 2 comparison tests are analogs of the classical test for equality of 2 means and equality of k means in multivariate analysis. Tests for encompassing are also calculated and utilized to compare the forecasting methods. And the packages that were utilized were eViews 11 for most of the calculations, except for the multivariate comparison test, the Mariano-Prevey test, which was based on a recently compiled package in R by Drakal. Let me go into the findings now. The results of the encompassing tests point to a variety of methods that dominate, and this is based on joint encompassing tests for all the dozen or so forecasting methods in the comparison pool. There are 6 target variables, and this table summarizes the forecasting method that emerges as a dominating or encompassing procedure for each of the variables. For GDP, factor Midas turns out to be the encompassing test. None works out for the industrial production or merchandise exports variables. Factor Midas also works for the GDP deflator, whereas for CPI and for the producer price index, 2 other groups dominate. The dynamic factor model for CPI and variations of use of principal components and bridge equations for the producer price index. Taking a look at the mean absolute errors, this chart pertains to specific forecasting methods connecting the MAE values for each of the 6 target variables. For example, the purple line corresponds to factor Midas, red for DFM, etc. Except for the big blue line, each line refers to a specific forecasting model. The big blue line corresponds to the MAEs obtained when the 10 individual forecasts are averaged using the least squares regression weights obtained from the regression of actual values of a particular target variable like CPI or GDP on the 10 individual forecasts as regressors. The crisscrossing lines for the individual forecasts show that there is no clear winner among the 10 individual forecasts. Just about every method considered performs better in some cases, worse in other cases. These results, together with the encompassing results described earlier, point to forecast combination for improvement in forecast accuracy. Forecast averaging using the least squares weights improves on the forecast accuracy of the individual methods. And this applies in all 6 target variables, as you can see in this big blue solid line. How about other averaging schemes? It's not shown in the above graph, but the numerical values in the accompanying table, table 6, with numerical MAE values, showed that least squares weights delivered the lowest MAE for 5 of the 6 target variables, and second lowest by a small margin for producer's price index. So the current results that I just very rapidly went through produce the following findings at this point. Just about every method considered performs better in some cases and worse in other cases. Encompassing tests point to a variety of methods that dominate. favoring Midas for GDP and DFM for CPI. And in terms of predictive ability and MAE values and rankings, alternative forecasting methods show diverging relative values. And one viable approach under a situation where there's no clear winner is to combine forecasts to improve predictive accuracy. And in most cases, using least squares weights perform better for purposes of forecast averaging. So these are the main findings that we've obtained so far. And just to briefly go through what we look at as further research issues as a way of closing this presentation, we can look at a closer look at the magnitudes of the forecast errors and figure out whether these magnitudes are really good enough for practical purposes, such as for inflation targeting programs in the case of the forecast for CPI, multi-period forecasting horizons. There could be changing patterns in performance as you go in through multi-period forecasts. Further enhancements in forecasting model specification in terms of time dynamics, including more latent factors, additional explanatory variables such as utilizing aggregate labor market conditions index or financial conditions index, or self-rated poverty and happiness indexes that are currently being collected in the Philippines on a regular basis. And the question is the use of big data. And of course, from a practical point of view, also being able to capture impact of big sudden shocks like COVID-19. Thank you very much again for this opportunity. And Peter,
Well, thank you. Can I just ask a question before we go on? Is there any way to dig into the data properties that make one method better than the other? That is, what is it about GDP or CPI or so that makes one method superior to the other?
One way of dissecting that issue is to look more closely at how the individual models were formulated, what variables were utilized, and to see why one particular approach, like the dynamic factor model, works for GDP but not for CPI. As a matter of fact, that's what got us going in the 2018 chapter. We actually reported some results of that same situation where it's not clear. Sometimes this one method A does better than method B and others, and sometimes it's the opposite. And it could very well be because of the way the models are specified, and that with improvement in the specifications of the model, including different types of additional indicators, might change the picture. So there's still quite a bit of experimentation that needs to be done. But that's a very important question and difficult question to answer. I thought the DFM would turn out to be better than Midas because that was the horse that I was betting on. But as it turns out, you can't. There is no uniform definition to that. Suleiman might have some other comments on that.
Okay, are there any other comments? Then we'll move on to the last paper.
Thanks again, Peter.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Bobby. Willie, you and your team, Patrick, Abner, have been our go-to guys on everything agricultural for years, forever. I think it's appropriate that you give us your views on the COVID and agricultural markets as well. So thank you very much for doing this.
Well, thanks a lot for the opportunity today. Very much appreciate it. So I'm Pat Westline. We'll lead things off, talking a bit about some of the work we've done on COVID. Then Willie and Abner will talk a bit more about some of their memories of Dr. Klein and what it's meant to us over the years. So we'll talk about COVID-19's effective food and agricultural markets, talk about our modeling approach briefly, and then some of the key results for crop and livestock sector markets for farm commodities, for U.S. farm income and consumer food prices in this country. So there's lots of ways, of course, COVID-19 can and has affected agricultural markets. On the demand side, of course, more food is being consumed at home, especially during the lockdown days, far less at restaurants. The recession and lower incomes affected food consumption choices. People are driving less, so that affects fuel prices and also affects the demand for biofuels. And we, of course, have lower sales of clothing, which has reduced the demand for cotton and other fibers. On the supply side of things, we have meat packing plant shutdowns, especially in this country, especially in the April-May period of time. We have labor availability issues for farms, for food processors, for shippers, and for retailers, border closures, other restrictions on movement of goods, and challenges just in producing and delivering products to match demand shifts. What someone might buy at a supermarket versus what they would buy if they went to a restaurant. The macro assumptions here, again, we're not macroeconomists, so we take our macro projections from IHS Markit, the successor organization to that founded by Dr. Klein. And so this is from their estimates from July. And so in July, they were projecting global economic recession of 5.5% for calendar year 2020. We see the recovery there in 2021. US is down 6.1% this year and up almost 4% next year. Another way to put that in perspective is to look at what US GDP would have looked like if we just had 1.9% annual growth from 2019 forward. And you can see that IHS Markit's current projections show it takes a number of years to get back to that, to that trend line, if you will. Actual growth was a bit faster from 2010 to 2019, but IHS Markit's been projecting a bit slower growth in front of us even before COVID-19 hit. So our modeling approaches, we have multi-market partial equilibrium models of US and global agricultural markets. We estimate production, use, stocks, trade, and prices for the major commodities. We cover the major grains, so corn, wheat, sorghum, barley, oats, rice, etc. The major oilseeds, soybeans, sunflowers, peanuts, etc. Cotton, sugar, livestock products, dairy, and poultry. For the US only, we do farm income, farm program spending, and consumer food prices. These models, of course, are a legacy of work by Drs. Womack and Myers, with the inspiration from Dr. Klein. Modeling work began at what is now USDA's Economic Research Service. FAPRI started in the 1980s here at the University of Missouri and at Iowa State University. Our team now collaborates with colleagues at various universities, such as Texas A&M, University of Arkansas, University of Nevada, Texas Tech, and a number of others as well. And overseas, we've done a lot of work with OECD, FAO, the European Commission, and teams in many other countries, including Europe, Asia, and Latin America. So about our analysis here. So many of the following slides are going to compare our FAPRI baseline projections released in March with projections released in August or September. So each baseline is based on information available at that time, including IHS Markit macro projections. Baselines assume current policies, so existing trade agreements like the USMCA continue indefinitely into the future. The March baseline assumes efforts are not completely successful to meet commitments under the phase 1 agreement between the United States and China. So it resulted in increased exports of US agricultural products to China, but not to the level that was specified in the agreement. In August, we're reflecting observed behavior, which is maybe a little bit less aggressive than we would have assumed back in our numbers from earlier this year. The March baseline was prepared in early 2020, mostly in the month of January, lapsing it a bit into February, when the only known COVID cases at the time were in China. So again, there was no assumption here at that time, of any major outbreak in the United States. COVID-19 is the single most important difference in these projections between the March numbers and the August numbers. But other factors, of course, matter as well. Weather, policy changes, data revisions, and everything else that you've heard about in terms of trying to do nowcasts, if you will. That's just not fair to say observed differences at all because of COVID-19. But I deliberately picked slides that follow where COVID-19 is probably the main reason for the changes observed. We did some separate analysis that I've reported here in April and May that isolated early COVID impacts, and it was broadly consistent with what I'm going to show you now. So here's a couple ones I want to pick. I want to talk first about what's happened on the livestock side. So as I said, we had a lot of US packing plants shut down or at least slowed their activities for a period of time this spring. That meant that animals could not be processed at the rate they would have otherwise been, caused a shortage of meat at the consumer level, and contributed to a significant increase in retail prices, especially this spring. For the year as a whole, we're estimating a retail price of 6% higher now than we would have said back in January. You can see it flips around after 2021. We do have some spillover effects in the slower macroeconomy, and of course, what's happened in terms of animals backing up and things like that, and lower feed costs all contribute to a bit lower retail prices for beef and for the livestock products after 2021. But while the retail price to consumers has gone up, the price paid to farmers has gone down. Live cattle prices are lower in 2020 than they were going to be otherwise, 11% difference from earlier estimates. And again, this all goes back to that packing plant issue. If packing plants couldn't process the animals that farmers had to sell, they could bid less for those animals and did so. And cause this backlog to occur, throw in the lower feed costs, throw in some other factors that are occurring in recent months. And we're talking about lower cattle prices, not just in 2020, but probably for several years to come. Biology plays a factor here, remembering that it takes a while from the time animals are born to the time they move through the system has to be taken into account in these projections. On the hog side, the difference is even more dramatic. The drop in hog prices at the farm level is 27% relative to what we would have said back in March. And it takes some time for that to recover as well. Switching gears now, talking about driving habits. So because of COVID-19, people drove a lot less this spring, and even now, mileage driven is a bit less than it would normally be. So there's a significant drop projected in total motor gasoline use in the United States and in many other countries around the world as well in 2020. Most of the ethanol that we use in our fuel system in this country is used in 10% blends. And so it's not a coincidence that if you look at the right-hand chart compared to the left-hand chart, you see that the amount of ethanol used in this country is almost exactly 10% of motor gasoline use. We have a little bit being used in higher level blends, but not very much. So that's a sharp drop in ethanol demand, and ethanol demand is right up there with feed consumption for livestock as the major use of corn in this country. Corn is the most produced agricultural product, not just in this country, but in the world. So what happens in the corn market affects everything else as well. So the result of that is we have lower prices for corn in the marketing year that just ended on August 31st, and the marketing year that we're in right now, the 2021 marketing year. And we estimate a difference of about 12% in corn prices for the 2021 year now versus estimates done earlier this year. That gap does narrow across time, but again, it takes time for things to adjust. We're building up stocks of corn right now, since less was used this past year that would normally be used, we're carrying more into the next year, and that has consequences across the board. Another one that's been sharply hit is cotton, because people have not been able to shop as frequently as they would have normally shopped, and don't need an extensive wardrobe to be in Zoom calls forever. We've had less domestic mill use in this country and around the world. The difference in 2019-20 is about 15% relative to earlier estimates, and that's had a big impact on cotton prices globally as well. So not just focusing on the US only, telling some stories on the farm income side. Here's first what's happened to receipts paid to farmers for the crops and livestock products that they sell. So in the case of feed grains, oils, and cotton, you see the drops that we've kind of mentioned already. The proportional term being the drop in cotton being the largest. Note there's one exception to this rule here is food grains, so rice and wheat. Rice in particular is a commodity where prices actually increased in the short run after COVID-19 hit. Part of it had to do with, probably a commodity where income allowances are small, maybe even negative, but also had to do with countries perhaps panicking a bit in the short run and closing off export sales, et cetera, that pushed up rice prices in the short run. Now, some of that's correcting itself now, but it's taken a few months for that to occur. On the livestock side, again, very dramatic drops, as we talked about already, for cattle, for hogs, for dairy, for poultry. And you see the overall drop around 9% in overall receipts to farmers paid in this country. Taking those changes in receipts for crops and for livestock, and then considering other factors, you get to net farm income. So government payments are up dramatically this year in this country. Some of that is a function of existing government programs that automatically increase payments when prices are lower, but most of it is because of ad hoc programs that have been passed either by Congress or just enacted by the administration under broad authorities to make payments to farmers. So those payments have offset a lot of the negative impacts that always would have occurred to the farm sector. Production expenses are lower for things like fuel and also for feed produced in the sector, and purchase livestock costs, of course, are down as well with lower livestock prices. So the overall effect on net farm income, you can see there, it's a small fraction of the change that's occurring on the receipt side because of all the other offsetting factors that have occurred. Interestingly, we just put this report out last week, and it's getting a fair amount of attention because USDA right now is trying to decide what another round of support payments might look like. And as you can imagine, people in the farm sector want to get some additional payments to offset all the losses that they feel they've occurred. But on the other hand, here we are showing only a relatively modest impact on net farm income once existing programs are taken into account. It's when we look forward to 2021, that's shown here, that we do show a significant drop in farm income next year if there's no payments provided to the sector and things evolve as we currently estimate. Then the consumer side of things, we already mentioned meat prices being one area where prices have been higher than estimated previously. And that increase in meat prices alone was enough to push up the overall CPI so far this year. And so for the first time in quite some time, we're looking at food price inflation in the United States of over 3% this year. We've been running over 4% year over year food price inflation the last 2 or 3 months, but we expect that to moderate over the last few months of the year. But then for 2021, as we have those continued low prices at the farm level for livestock and for other major agricultural products, and as assuming that we don't have another round of COVID outbreaks in late winter and spring, processing plants go back to more normal activities, and what had been a very widespread between farm and retail prices narrows dramatically. So we're actually looking at lower food price inflation than previously estimated in 2021 and 2022. So summary again, the COVID-19 has had major impacts on the ag commodity markets, on farm income, and on consumer food prices. For most major U.S. commodities, farm level prices are lower than they would otherwise be because of processing disruptions and changes in consumption patterns tied to mobility restrictions and a weaker macroeconomy. These effects really outweigh any disruptions to farm level supplies. However, U.S. consumer food prices have increased, especially for meats, as plant disruptions have pushed down farm prices and pushed up consumer prices. So the big question, of course, is we're trying to do our projections out for the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, is when do things get back to back to normal? And will the new normal look the same as the old normal? Will there be changes in consumer purchasing habits that will persist? Will those cause some changes in supply chains that may have effects down the road? Kind of taking off on some of the earlier comments, yes, we rely on our models for much of this, but we also rely on expert opinion a lot. So we try to keep in touch with other folks who are following developments. And if there's a need to do so, we'll incorporate those expert judgments into our projections for the future as well. So again, thanks for the opportunity. That's what I had to say. And I'll turn it over to Willie and Abner to say a few words.
Thanks a lot, Pat. I just wanted to say that it's great to see all of you, many of you we have met in the past meetings. Like many of you have mentioned, I also have been impressed with Professor Klein's caring and humanitarian attitude toward everyone he met, and this is reflected in the focus of his work as well. I think I've been fortunate to meet most of you in meetings, and I was looking back at the Santiago meeting at the 50-year anniversary document, which was very impressive, and to see that one of us at FAPRI has been able to participate most years since the mid-1980s, and we gained a lot from that interaction with you, and Abner's going to say a little bit more about that in a second. I just wanted to say that we gained so much from our interactions with Professor Klein, and also with all of you who embody his attitudes and his outlook and his approach. I think as a little bit of an outsider, I want to say that his legacy includes all of you, as well as many others who were trained and influenced, and even more people as you have paid it forward to your students. Abner Walmach was the first of us at FAPRI to work with Professor Klein, and he's going to highlight some of the key contributions that Dr. Klein had to getting FAPRI started in the first place. And as Pat mentioned, not just the activity, but the philosophy that econometrics is not enough. You also need to have knowledge of the markets and the industries that you're working with. So Abner, I'm going to turn it over to you. Your microphone is off, Abner.
How about now? Am
Go
I on
ahead.
now?
Yeah.
Am I on now?
Yeah.
Yes, you're on.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be included in this tribute to Professor Klein. My time goes back to 1970 and the first meeting with him. I was working in the Economic Research Service in an econometric team that was designed to put together first computerized models and get them on the computer using Fortran programming. And we were able to do that in about 6 months period of time. But once we put them together, I had a very difficult time getting the equations to reach a simultaneous solution. At the same time, we were looking for linkage to a general economy, and we're already using up tremendous computer time. And we're informed by the USDA that we needed to look into linkages with Wharton. And I was sent there for 3 days, and I've never met such a gracious person. He really opened his door. What do you need? Well, first of all, we're having trouble getting our models solved. Could I talk with your econometric unit? Have you right over there in a minute. What else do you need to know? I need to know something about your global model so I can go back and tell the people at DC they're interested in hooking up with you. He immediately took me to the econometric unit. About 30 minutes or so, we understood that they were using the Gauss-Seidel iteration method, zipped right through, gave solutions quickly. Okay, we got that problem solved. Now, how about your global model? And he opens the door and there's a room full of people. One cubbyhole. France, another cubbyhole, Germany. Okay, start with France. Okay, so I sit down with France and I go to Germany and I go around the room. And it was obvious that when you looked at his work, that it was structural bound. And it was market oriented going from the farmer up or whatever the industry was, but those equations were structurally sound or better be. Very impressed with what I found. The pattern was very similar from one module to another. And you could see his footprint over everything that we went through. So he asked me to sit down for a meeting when we departed. Do you have any questions? Yes, sir, I do. You hire a person into a module there. How long does it take them to get involved in the modeling? He says immediately. When the person sits down in France, they are that day a France specialist. Wow. Okay, how about the modeling side? He says, well, if I review the models and they say to me, this specification that I'm using is because the computer gave me that answer. He says, I do one thing. I ask them to get their books and their belongings and I walk them to the door. They need to find another profession. That really impressed our team when we got back to the USDA, and immediately we hooked up with Wharton and bought their services. And every Outlook conference from then on, we were involved. And we would compare our estimates, we would compare our model building, and he would drop by in our unit sometime when he was in Washington, and you could tell the entire ERS just stopped when he came walking in. Everybody really knew that he was a leader and he had a tremendous impact on all of us. Secondly, Willie and I moved out to the university system in the early 1980s, and we began to try to put together a group of universities that Pat's just told you about under one umbrella, which we would call the umbrella FAPRI, Food and Ag Policy Research, but it was an umbrella over several universities, and pick out econometricians that would get on the same team so that when we plugged our models together at different universities, they would work with each other. And we were able to do that, but we were having a lot of trouble with our administration. And they were very leery of us working with Congress directly because they'd gotten into situations before where it created political disturbance. And it could have involved their funding coming from DC. So they were very nervous about that. We called Professor Klein, asked if he helped with that. And he said, be right down. Set me a meeting up with the president, the chancellor, and your deans. Well, I'd never been in the president, chancellor, dean's office that much. But when we called up and said Klein would be there, they said when. I had the pleasure of picking him up at St. Louis, driving him over for an hour and 15 minutes to Columbia and doing the same thing going back. Marvelous conversations. And when he got there, he says, I understand you have this problem. Now, let me tell you, I think this is what you ought to do. Make sure that this research is neutral. They will run a baseline similar to what we do. Congress will probably ask them for scenarios around that baseline. Then you run baselines, but make sure they're neutral. How do you do that? Well, when you take a request from Congress, be sure that both sides have signed a letter and have them send a letter to you. And then when you go there, be sure when you present the presentation and you present the options that are being considered for comparison to the baseline, be sure that you walk away and say your decision and never choose one side or the other. And so that really satisfied the universities. And that's the theme behind everyone that comes into the FAPRI unit, that it will be neutral and those decisions will be made in Congress. And therefore, that one little piece of information helped us prevent getting caught up into political dialogue. And it's been that way ever since. We never have really had a political problem as long as we walk in and conduct ourselves that way. Another thing I think that impressed him about our research, and I'll be brief about that, was we had the farm financial crisis in the early 80s. We had extremely high interest rates, energy and exchange rate, and too much production. And our farmers were going broke. We already had VOPR running interest rate up, summer farmers paying as much as 18%. And I talked to Professor Klein about that coming out. Didn't you guys realize you're going to knock out the livestock ag industry? He says, yeah, but somebody had to go. Thank you very much, Professor. I'm on that side. So we get there and we began to do a national survey because Washington was very slow in picking up that, but we were making presentations to farmers and too many were at the door when we went out. You knew why they were there. They were going out of business. And those that had come in recently were the ones that were caught in the biggest problem. They were highly leveraged and the debt level was really zooming. By the time we got to 1984, land prices had dropped by 25%. They dropped 50% in 1985. Washington just wasn't in tune with that. So we called up Farm Journal magazine with over 1 million subscribers. And they allowed us to use their base to pull a sample. And we did that and working with our state, we figured out that the debt level was enormous. It couldn't be serviced. We called Dr. Klein and asked him what we could do about that. He says, I'll run it through my model. So I'll tell you the answer. The debt level is that high, can't be serviced. It's going to increase the interest rates, which were already high. And that's exactly what happened, about 1.5 points. The National Corn Growers Association took that number to the director of OMB and pointed out to him that this crisis was so severe that it would spill over into the general economy. And at the time, the leaning was more for free market agriculture with very little support. And they were able to convince the administration, including the president, that this was serious. And they came back with an omnibus bill in '86 that put 1.3 billion additional money back into agriculture for 10 years. So in that first round, the first thing we hit on dealing with Washington was a $13 billion change as a result of our research. So it really put us on the map, but we wouldn't have been there, as you can understand, if he hadn't been holding our hand. As a result of that, they said to us, if you're successful in getting funding to to put your institute together that is neutral. I will support you and you have access to our projections from now on. I don't care what happens and where this company goes. You will always have access as long as we can compare results. I think in about 2002, the team that had purchased work at that time moved everything out here to be next to us, and it's still here. Their Agricultural and Economic Unit is a neighboring system here at the university with students coming in and out of each one of those. So to say he had an impact on us is you just can't possibly think of enough.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And I want to thank all four presenters. I mean, it's clear to me that econometric modeling is alive and well, and Larry would have liked it. So I guess we now have time to share our reminiscences, our experiences. Hand over to Adolfo.
Hey, Peter, I'm going to sign off. It's midnight here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, Larry. Bye.
Bye. Adolfo, is it you?
No, but I just thought that I was going to start, but it's okay. No answer, no answer.
Ignacio's already there. Briefly, I just want to say that we have a channel on live Facebook, and there have been lots of very encouraging and grateful messages from the faculty and the students from the university. I give that message to you. Thank you. Please, Adolfo. And Ignacio.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this conference, especially Juan Rafael, for inviting us to honor Larry Klein's legacy on the day he was born 100 years ago. It is amazing that it is about 50 years that we first met. And it is already 100 years that he was born. Now, we are here to remember again how much we owe to Klein for his contribution, his teaching, his generous advice, his friendship. Today, we take it for granted, but it was for Larry Klein's often almost single-handed effort to get the economic profession to shift resolutely to the use of quantitative analysis for forecasting, for economic policy making, and for the empirical study in general of economic phenomena. It is well known how successful he was in understanding and forecasting the economic upturn following World War II, with the increase of consumer demand associated with the return of millions of servicemen from the war to the US, who were not all to be unemployed as many of the time had foreseen, and similarly successfully anticipated the mild recession that followed the end of the Korean War and the efforts of the effects of the Yom Kippur War and the ensuing oil embargo on the American and the world economy. Now, discontinuities and non-linearities are indeed a fact of life that are at odds with the stationarity and ergodicity hypothesis on which so much econometricians rely to produce estimates of the parameters of our models. Klein knew it very well, and indeed we have learned that the boat that he used to sail with in the Michigan Lake with Ted Anderson and Trygve Helmo at the time of the Coles Commission was aptly called ergodic. and it was indeed badly damaged by the shock of a major storm. And he knew, as he wrote, that economic life does not follow a linear model. Therefore, he never shied from using knowledge and information from outside the forecasting econometric models, as we have also learned from Suleiman, to improve the simulation results. Art as much of science, all to be used, as he wrote with Harry and McCarthy, with tender loving care. We should not forget another of his lessons, that generally speaking, great ratios, which could today qualify as co-integrating factors, are not stable enough. It is the assumption of stability that is behind so much mean reversion that we observe, and as policy makers, we contrast in the mechanical use of error correction models, even by our most brilliant econometricians. Indeed, observing that after World War II, econometrics moved into what can be called the age of Klein, Paul Samuelson once added that it'd be ironic if, looking inside the Wharton model, we found in the end Lawrence Klein. To this, Arthur Ocon was quickly responding that there were lots of reasons to believe that Klein could perform better when he had these models to provide a systematic basis for the use of all the information available. Today, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic is heavily influencing social and economic developments. We central bankers discuss very much of the implications of prolonged household and business uncertainty on consumer demand and business investment. Two issues are prominent as a result of this major discontinuity. The possibility that the increase in the propensity to save, induced in several countries by the lockdown of economic activity, would be followed by a prolonged increase in the precautionary saving, stimulated by a too slow a reduction in the level of uncertainty. And the second, the risk as conditions normalize that companies' insolvencies and defaults may jeopardize the recovery of economic activity and jobs creation through the generation of substantial financial instability. These issues, their possible effects on inflation expectations and real interest rates and natural rates of interest, only to mention two variables that are only indirectly observable, if at all, are crucial to define our policy responses, both monetary and fiscal, as well as structural. I often ask myself how Larry would have dealt with them. He would have certainly devised new and interesting ways to use the external information we have from surveys around the world. And he would also have added a third issue that we should not ignore, the distributional consequences of this crisis, which call us to consider, as he used to say, not only the means, but also other moments of the integration of microeconomic functions over the joint distribution of the variables that determine effective demand and employment. To conclude, we were fortunate to learn from and work with Lawrence Klein. Indeed, as the poet William Wordsworth wrote in the dawn of the French Revolution, to become unfortunately disillusioned from the way it turned over, something that will certainly not to be the case with the revolution in econometrics brought about by Larry Klein, I quote, "Bliss was in the dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." To conclude that those who lived and survived that experience were called upon to exercise their skill, not in utopia, subterranean fields, but in the very world, which is the world of all of us, the place where in the end we find our happiness or not at all. The real world, indeed, we have been taught by Larry Klein to care about. Thank you very much.
Peter, please allow me. I missed the point. I thought you were asking for questions. But of course, we are now in the second session of this important virtual meeting. And there is little time and a lot of participants. So I was going to give the floor directly to Ignacio Visco, what already happened. And for the rest of participants, I am going to tell them to take the floor automatically after previous one and pay attention to the time allowed. Please, second participant, I'm afraid Joaquin Vial is not over here. The following one is
Tayyib Shabir. I can help you a little bit.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, right.
Okay, thank you, Honorable Chairperson, Professor Adolfo Castilla. I also want to thank Professor Juan Vargas for an invitation to this event. It's truly heartwarming to see so many distinguished colleagues gathered here today to mark the centennial celebration, honoring the legacy of Lawrence Klein. I was very fortunate to benefit from Lawrence Klein by being one of his students and was honored to be his colleague at Penn. And my singular experience that I've chosen to highlight today to mark the 100-year anniversary of Laurie Klein's birth is to recall the fantastic opportunity that I got to co-author and co-edit with him a volume on financial crisis published by Edgar Algar in 2007. His interest in this subject showed the breadth of Laurie's intellectual palette, which undoubtedly went beyond pure econometrics and macroeconomic forecasting, areas, of course, that he's best known for. I recall with great fondness the intellectually stimulating discussions with Lawrence Klein about the relationship between inequality and financial crises. He had a deep interest in both these areas. He was, of course, quite a visionary, since this is a research topic that has been attracting significant attention in the last few years. It was a very rewarding experience to work together on this topic more than 15 years ago in connection with the volume on financial crisis. Now, rather than describe the contents of the volume, I want to share with you how Laurie treated his colleagues in the profession with tremendous generosity and ample praise. I'm sure something that most of us already know, but I just want to share my personal experience, how I felt that it was remarkable. Now, during our work together with the preparation of that edited volume, I would often draft an email or a letter to a prospective contributor, and I would be quite polite and complimentary. However, Laurie would always find a stronger language to complement the addressees. For example, if I would say, as an expert in the field, we would like you to contribute, he would change it to, as a renowned expert in the field with remarkable accomplishments, we would like you to consider contributing, etc. Now, this is not a verbatim quote. This is just to convey how Laurie was so very generous with his praise of the colleagues he would deal with. Now, besides his tremendous professional accomplishments, Laurie's generosity and humility, as many have noted this today already, these are things that I remember the best about him. He was certainly a giant amongst men. We miss him, but his long-lasting influence lives on. Thank you for this opportunity to share a few of my memories of Lawrence Klein. Thank you.
Carlo Dada, please. Microphone. Carlo, put the microphone on in your screen, down on the left-hand side.
Okay, here we are.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. First of all, my thanks to Juan Rafael for this beautiful initiative. And I want to say that I'm happy to see many friends among you. Let me say that every time I think of Larry Klein, the memory of my first meeting with him comes back to my mind. It was in the occasion of a Project Link meeting that took place in Newport. Had
Microphone.
for project under the lead of Jim Ball and Jean Valbrook, were meeting their American colleagues. Giorgio Basevi and I, involved in the construction for never met Larry Klein before. There were many issues to discuss, including aspects of the national models under construction. Since the weather was very hot after 4 p.m., most
Carlo, we don't hear you.
Carlo, the microphone. Carlo, microphone is not on.
again. Can you hear me now?
Now, yes.
So, and shall I go back? Adolfo, shall I go back?
Do it.
But again?
Yeah. No.
So I was remembering the first encounter with Larry Klein. For the first time, the group of researchers who had started their collaboration for Project Link in Europe, under the lead of Jim Ball and Jean Valbrook, were meeting their American colleagues. Giorgio Basevi and I, involved in the construction of an econometric model for Italy, had never met Larry Klein before. There were many issues to discuss, including aspects of the national model under constructions. Since the weather was very hot, after 4 p.m., most of the participants, who were in Newport, moved to the beach in search of an immersion in the fresh water of the ocean. The second day, Larry wanted me to sit near him on the sand for the purpose of inquiring whether the financial submodel of Italy might be overdetermined. His manners, friendly, humble, and so distinguished, conquered me. Over many years, that initial intuition was always confirmed, even made deeper. I know that mentioning a little episode of personal relevance in speaking of a prominent and recognized personality may appear something insignificant for a recollection addressed to a public of experts. Yet I like to remind that little episodes and behavior details often reveal deep and fundamental aspects of a character. Larry Klein was not only a great scientist, a Nobel Prize, but also a true master of young researchers, needing to grow in their human sensitivity as well as in their intellectual education. For the Bologna Link team of young economists, initially guided by Nino Andreatta, who later became Italian Treasury Minister, the experience matured in Project Link was a precious opportunity of professional progress and also starting point of a of a collective enterprise, initially a joint venture of primary business managers and our group of economists, all interested in econometric forecasting, and later a business consulting unit, now employing several hundreds of graduate researchers in economic disciplines. Professor Klein encouraged us in this ambitious project and generously was present at the foundation meeting in 1974, speaking extensively of the Project Link experience. Let me touch, before concluding this short recollection of Larry Klein, another aspect of his personality that I always noted during the long contact with him. I mean his constant concern for establishing ties among researchers and among research teams. Anytime there was the possibility of opening the intellectual collaboration with research groups that for political or other reasons had been inaccessible for much time, he was favorable to start a new initiative. In a sense, Project Link, the denomination of the great enterprise we are all familiar with, perfectly epitomized this attitude. That he was convinced that opening is always preferable to closing or ignoring, more favorable to results of mutual interest. This is an attitude that I have always admired and wished, if possible, to imitate. Such a thought is particularly present to me in these days, in which years of efforts to demolish barriers among nations and to build an international legal order seem forgotten and menace to vanish. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Juan Carlos Moreno, please.
Juan Rafael, thank you very much for the invitation to be here honoring Larry. We miss him very, very much. My recollection is not going to be so much about him, but about his legacy. An inspiration that I was years ago, 2003, 2007, guiding a project. We had started a project on capacity building on macroeconomic policy design, implementation, and evaluation. And we didn't know how to do that, to be frank. I mean, we said, well, what better starting piece would be than Larry Klein? So we went to Larry Klein, basically to his inspiration, to the way he started Project Link. And Project Link, in the Professor's World speech presenting Larry Klein the Nobel Prize, he said his most then recent achievement was Project Link, which tied together economic macro models for different countries. And yes, it was mentioned the third world and the communist countries at that time, integrating models to a total system, etc., as you well know. Well, at that time, Central America had a communist country, Nicaragua had a dollarized country, El Salvador, and you name it. It was a fascinating region. And I had the opportunity to work with Juan Rafael and also with Peter Pauly, Ada Samuelson, and a big team. And much more than dwell into the econometric, let me dwell into the legacy of the institutional capacity building, because that project, based on Larry's view that they had to respect the neutrality that one of our colleagues was mentioning before, the institutional context, the historical, the political considerations. So what we did was we went to the central banks of each of those countries and starting meeting young researchers, well, first the central bank, the president, the governor, and convincing them that we needed as a region to have a community of interest, a community of visions of the world. It was not that the Economic Commission of Latin America was going to push for a certain macroeconometric model of that country, but we're going to build it with respect. The idea was sharing data, sharing views of the world, and what we managed with this project was to create that capacity, technical capacity, and trust, in particular trust between these young researchers. Can you imagine one from a very communist institution at that time with a very liberal institution sitting together and sharing data? And well, how do you see inflation? What do you think are the determinants of inflation? Well, let's see, let's share, let's then meet again, and then no, at that time, the idea was not data mining, was data building. It was because you had to look for the data, share the data, listen, this has to be an Excel spreadsheet that we can use, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Larry managed with his work, with his legacy, a very, very important thing that he said in his acceptance speech. He said, I hope that my own researchers, I'm quoting him, have gone some small distance towards the goal of improving economic aspects of life. He certainly did that in Central America with, inspired by him, with the Economic Commission Latin America, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the UN, the Monetary Council of Central America, researchers like the University of Costa Rica, and other academic centers of that region. It was certainly fascinating, and just as an anecdote, one of my colleagues at that time, Luis Aquino, he was working at the central bank, and the IMF came with, the big, big guns to say that the projections that the people at the central bank were doing on dollarization were just not good enough. And he said, well, let me show you. And then he showed a macroeconometric model that he had built consistent with the vision of the region. And then the IMF at that time had to take him very seriously and listen, whoa, this is a very different ballgame. And in that sense, I think the legacy and the spirit of Larry did help to create a better region. We have lots of problems, but that spirit, the view that you have to have respect, you have to have conscience of trust between researchers, and that it's important to consider their own priorities, their own visions of the world. And I think this is one of the great thanks that I have to give to Larry in the name of the region, or at least in the name of the Economic Commission Latin America at that time, that we ended up being respected by central banks, because at that time the Economic Commission was in, these structuralists, what do you know about econometrics? And then it happens that, it was not that the structuralists knew about econometrics, but they knew not the particular specifics of each nation, but we knew how to respect talent, how to build trust in the spirit of Larry. So thank you very much, Juan Rafael. It was the opportunity actually to get to know you. And right now, like in Casablanca, welcome to the usual suspects, and Peter also. Thank you very much.
Pedro, please. Pedro Palma. Microphone.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Juan Rafael, for the occasion and for the opportunity of talking about Larry. The first time I met Larry was when he was my teacher. I took his econometric courses at Penn, and then later on as my advisor. At that time, I thought I was a little bit masochist because I had two advisors, Jerry Adams and Larry Klein, asking me for more and more on my dissertation, but that was, very useful at the end. I invited Larry 3 times to come down to Venezuela. The first time it was in late 1974. He was not very well known down there in Latin America at that time. So, his visit was very useful, very, fantastic and so on, but not lots of public pay attention to his visit. The second time it was in 76 when he was advising. He was the senior advisor for the campaign of President Carter. And then he was more well-known person down here in Venezuela. And the third time it was months after he won the Nobel Prize. And it was lots of people interested in meeting him and listen to him. Later on, Larry invited me to go to, on a regular basis, to the LINC meetings. And since late 1970s or early 1980s, I, attended the meetings often. From that frequent meetings, where we developed, my wife, Maria Cristina, and Sonia and Larry developed a very close friendship, and we really enjoy their companionship. Maria Cristina, my wife, was teasing all the time Sonia. I remember that a funny thing that when we met in Salamanca, we were in a middle-age building. It was no air conditioning in any room, but it was not necessary because it was the climate was fine. But then Maria Cristina, teasing Sonia, said, "Oh, well, Sonia, you know, the air conditioning in my room is so cold and so on. And Sonia said, do you have air conditioning in your room? And Larry Klein doesn't have any air conditioning in his room. You know, it was unbelievable for her. But, you know, then we laugh about that teasing. But after Larry passed in 2013, I wrote an article that I want to share with you, just a part of that article that I published in one Venezuelan newspaper. I said from the frequent meetings that we share in different parts of the world, it was born a close friendship that remained and increasing for many years. That allows me to perceive the extraordinary human condition that he possessed. Despite his brilliance and genius, recognized and admired by all who knew him, he was a person of great modesty, kindness, and generosity, always willing to help and dedicate his precious time to anyone who approached him in search of his guidance and sapience. As a tireless traveler who was attending the multiple invitations made to him from all over the world to lecture or to participate in academic events, he came to Venezuela on three occasions to participate in forums where the global economic outlook was analyzed. Curiously, on Monday, October the 21st, year 2013, when the biannual meeting of the Link Project, of Project Link, was beginning at the United Nations headquarters in New York, we learned about his passing a few hours earlier. That news filled all of us with nostalgia, remembering the so many pleasant occasions that we shared with him in the past. For me, that was a sorrowful moment, not only because of the losing of my teacher and mentor from whom I learned so much, but also because of the final departure of a friend who I so much appreciated. Thank you very much, Juan Rafael, and it was really a pleasure to see many of you, many good friends in this fantastic meeting in honor of Larry Klein. Thank you.
Now my good friend from Angola, Susana Camacho. Susana?
My audio, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like, if you allow me, to share a quick picture. Will take only some seconds. Let me see. How is it? Let me see. Oh. Tela, let me see. Oh. I don't know if you can see the picture right now.
No, we can.
Picture?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There it is. Yeah.
Quick picture. Yeah, thank you very much. Then I can come back and just to say, first of all, thank you very, very much again for the invitation. Thank you very, very much. It is a great pleasure to be here today and to participate in this meeting. And for sure, of course, I would like, I had to share that picture. First time I met Professor Klein, I was deeply impressed by his humility, vision, modesty, and for sure by his brilliant mind. It was in October 2004 at Link meeting. I still remember the discussions and of course some of his final remarks. For me, it was really a special moment. Come on, please. I was at the end of my 20s and it was like, wow, for me and for my other colleagues from Africa. You know, I'm an Angolan, I am from Africa, I'm a woman. You know how many women in Africa had this opportunity? Thank you so much. I really felt blessed, honored. I still remember it was really interesting for me and for my colleagues from Africa. And that picture is from Mexico City. It was in 2005. And I still remember me and the other colleagues there in Mexico. When we met him, I told to my colleagues, I had to take a picture, sorry. I was exciting, like, you know, for me it was something like, you know, in Africa, we had a few opportunities to find some of these brilliant minds. And I took a picture, and of course, me and my colleagues, other colleagues from Africa, we made so many questions, and he was like, just answered us like, as we, all of us knew him. Professor Klein has had a profound impact on us. I'm speaking about the African students, Angolan students, and for sure, his legacy for the economists, the econometrics from the African Angolan community has been important. As we say in Africa, let's continue to clap hands for his life and continue all his work. Last but not least, and I'm sure, Adolfo, I'm inside of my 5 minutes, I would use my last minutes to say some words to Peter. I know that the words today are for Professor Klein, but I would like to also thank you, Peter, for all these almost 20 years. Maybe I will not have the other opportunity because I'm not in touch with you every day. Thank you very much, because I still remember my colleagues and me joined the link group through the multi-year series of workshops on macroeconometrics modeling organized at the University of Pretoria, organized between University of Pretoria and the United Nations, where Professor Peter served as one of our instructors. As we say in Africa, we also honor alive people, not only died people. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susana. Our dear friend from Venezuela too, Cristina Rodriguez, please.
Good morning to you all. To begin, I want to thank Juan Rafael and the University of Costa Rica for this invitation, which allows me to share with you some memories of Professor Klein in this centennial celebration. I met Professor Klein at WIFA when WIFA was part of the University of Pennsylvania. It was in the early 70s when Pedro Palma, a dear friend who was a PhD student at Penn, invited me to get acquainted with WIFA and to work in an econometric financial sector model for the Venezuelan economy. From that time, I remember Sonia, Professor Klein's wife, as well as Professors Ross Preston, Jerry Adams, and Abel Bertrand del Rio working at WIFA. Years later, Professor Klein invited me to join Project Lane. When I knew Professor Klein, I was astonished by the depth of his knowledge, but most of all, by his gentleness, kindness, and generosity, which were only parts of the outstanding qualities that distinguished him. I remember on occasion, I was working at WIFA in a cubicle. It was in front of Sonia's office. It was wintertime, and Professor Klein came back and told Sonia he had lost one of his gloves. And Sonia said, well, Laura, you will get Klein. He only said, Sonia, I'm sorry. I was very much amused because it was very well known. His exceptional memory and me, the humbleness of his attitude. It was Professor Klein. He was something very special, which impressed everyone who met him. Thank you very much. And it was for me really a pleasure to see you all. Bye.
Thank you, Christina. Carl Weinberg now.
Hi, everybody. Juan Rafael, congratulations, and thank you for pulling together this meeting of everyone to celebrate the life of Larry Klein and the influence it's had on all of us. I think that the first observation has to be that one of Larry Klein's greatest legacies and greatest contributions is us. That here we all are electronically linked, and we are a family. We are an intellectual machine, a neural network, if you will, of people all around the world that all have in common the experience of what Larry Klein has told us about the world. That we can all get on the phone, and Pedro can join my class in New York, or Juan Rafael can invite me to a seminar, or Adolfo, we can talk about this and that, or I can participate at the University of Bologna, or do any number of things. And that's all possible because Larry Klein brought us together. So if nothing else, he was a judge of people, and he pulled together a network of people that made his work stronger and better, in addition to making each of us better people and better contributors to society, to the world around us. That's what I learned from him, that Klein's eyes were not just on his equations, of which he was a master, or on his statistics, of which he was an expert, but rather they were on the world. And I'd like to bring 3 vignettes to you from my experience with Larry Klein to demonstrate how, to talk about how he taught me to open my eyes and to look at the world. And that is the most important gift that he gave me, that it's not just the equations and the numbers, but it's what's the world telling you and what are your equations telling you about the world. That's what matters. The first time I met him, my friend and former Link leader, Keith Johnson, brought me into his office to ask Klein to give me a job. Keith's motivation was to protect me from Irving Kravis, who I was working for at the time. Irving was producing 1 dissertation student every 9 years. Larry was producing 1 dissertation student a month. It seemed like a no-brainer that I had to be protected from Irving and brought into Klein's sphere. I walked into his office in McNeil Building in the corner, and there behind the desk was this man, all right, surrounded by piles of paper, computer printouts, all right? And of course, there were a line of students outside the door waiting to get in, but because Keith was in charge of Link, we just went right in. And Keith was in trouble because he ran the simulation, and the multiplier properties of that simulation just weren't right. And Klein said to him, Keith, when you look around you in the world, right, do you see that kind of a reaction of consumer spending to the changing government policy that was being introduced? And Keith said, well, no. He said, well, then there's something's got to be wrong with your model, all right? Go back and figure it out and come back. And then he said, who is this? And blah, blah, blah. I ended up working for Keith and for Laurie and for Link, and eventually was lucky enough to participate in this group over the years. But the point is, the first thing that I remember him saying was, look around you at the world and see what the world is telling you, and then learn from that what your model is not telling you, and turn that into something useful that you can interpret about the world around you, that it's the world that matters and not the model. Now, fast forward to 2007 to the Project Link meetings in Beijing, which is the last Link meeting that I remember Larry participating in. He participated by video. And he went through his forecast. These are my numbers. These are my forecasts. These are my analyses. This is whatever. And he ended with, he said, you know, he says, I want to talk to you like the weatherman on TV, since I am on TV. He said, if you're not seeing what we're saying, give us a call and tell us. And wow, I mean, this was the same message from 1973, 1974. Look at the world around you, and if the world isn't telling you, if you're not seeing what your model is saying, then it's time to revisit the model and to revisit what you're doing. A final anecdote, a year later, in the spring of 2008, I went to visit Larry in his office. It was the last time I saw him in his office, although not the last time that I saw him. And I was concerned about the global economic recession that was developing around us, the financial crisis. And I said to him, I said, Laurie, you grew up in the Great Depression. Your economic thinking was formed by your reminiscences and your recollections of the Depression. Are we in a depression now? And if we did, how would we know? what are you seeing? What did you see in the 1930s that told you that you were in an economic depression? And he said, well, you know, he says, in this event, he says, it's not really a depression. He says, in this event, you go to the bank and you want to buy a car, and the bank says you can't have a loan, and you go home and you feel bad. Or you go to the bank and you say, I want to buy a house, and the bank says you can't have a loan, and you go home and you feel bad. He said, in the depression, you went to the bank to cash a check so you could go to the grocery store to buy groceries, and the bank was boarded up and closed. He said, and you couldn't get any money out. He said, that was bad. He said, this is nothing compared to that. And that stuck in my mind as I went through the whole global financial crisis. And it's typical of the kind of observation that Larry could bring to something. After he was done with all the econometrics and all the simulation properties of the model, he would look at the world and say to you, well, this is what it means. And my path has been different from many of yours. I've taken a practitioner's path. I haven't gone into academics. I've been a practitioner of economics. And to me, the most important thing that I take away from my years with Laurie is the ability to look at the world and to see what the world is telling me, and then to use that to interpret what's going on for people who are coming to me for advice about how the world is developing. I could go on for hours, but I won't. But thank you again, Juan Rafael, for pulling together this meeting. It's a wonderful tribute to someone who's been a great influence on everybody in this Zoom meeting.
Alfredo Coutinho, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank my dear friend Juan Rafael Vargas and the University of Costa Rica for inviting me to participate in this tribute to Professor Lawrence Klein. At this time, I would like to share a brief passage of a personal tribute that I wrote in 2012, and which I entitled My Words to Lawrence Klein. It was 1984, and I was finishing my BA in economics at the National University of Mexico, when during one of my seminars on econometrics, I read about this American professor who was called something like the father of applied econometric models, since he was one of the pioneers of building a system of equations to represent the US economy. At that moment, it came to my mind something like, oh, I want to do something similar to that for my country. So months later, I realized that this professor was leading a successful research project on econometric modeling at the University of Pennsylvania, in which Mexico was included. I also discovered later that this professor was a Nobel laureate in economics. And for a particular reason, he was interested in the Mexican economy. So later on, after I completed my BA dissertation about an econometric model for the financial system, which was based precisely on a doctoral dissertation supervised by Professor Klein at the University of Pennsylvania. So I made contact with another economist in charge of the Mexican project in Philadelphia, for whom I started to work 5 years later and for a long decade. Working for Wharton Econometrics gave me the opportunity and privilege to meet in person the already famous 1980 Nobel laureate in economics, Lawrence Klein, who later became not only my best inspiration as an economist, but also my mentor and supervisor of my doctoral dissertation. My first professional contact with Professor Klein was at the beginning of the peso crisis in 1995, when I got the privilege of working directly for him in a research about the Mexican crisis, which constituted my first published academic paper with my name next to the name of a Nobel winner. During the preparation of my dissertation research, I spent hours, days, months, and years working under the strict supervision of Dr. Klein. The long discussions and debates between the teacher and the student became usual, but never a routine. One day, after a long discussion about the advantages of structural models, and in the sense of fine-tuning the model to shape the forecast as compared with the kind of models that we were working at that time, the high-frequency forecasting models. He responded to me, economists are not musicians to tone up econometric models as if they were musical instruments. So this was one of the best lessons I got from Professor Klein. To Lawrence Klein, I owe my professional career, not only as a student, but also the experience that I have having him as my mentor. I also owe him my formation as an economist and my strong responsibility as a professional, but overall, my commitment and passion for economics. I am, and I will always be, deeply thankful to Professor Klein. Thank you very much, and thank you to the University of Costa Rica for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. Please, Frank Dibble has the floor. Microphone. Now.
Sorry about that. And I was sort of laughing at other people with microphone troubles or microphone challenges earlier. Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Juan Rafael, for organizing this event and for inviting me. It's been just wonderful to, to hear people reminisce, of course, about Larry and how he guided them and in many cases launched and sustained careers. Certainly that's true with Larry and me. And it's wonderful to look at this group. Peter Pauly most definitely helped launch and sustain my career as well. Bobby Mariano as well. So it's so fun to see all of you and to hear stories from the old days. I had a really good laugh about Irv Kravis listening to Carl's story of that office visit. I'm glad you went with Larry also, Carl. Let me say a while ago now, of course, when Larry passed away, I did a blog post on him. I do a little blog, probably some of you have seen it. And I thought over the weekend that I'd just post it again, a good way to keep Larry's legacy alive, maybe help some people who knew him to reminisce once again, maybe introduce him to some people who did not know him. I'm not going to read it. That would be cruel and unusual. It's 5 or 6 paragraphs. But if you're interested, please take a look. But the reason I mention it is because, I didn't know what would come of it. It just seemed like the right thing to do. I think I posted it on Saturday. It has something like 3,400 page views since Saturday, just completely amazing. The legacy does live on, and I'm very, very proud of that, proud to have been a part of that. I thought that maybe one thing I could do in my remaining 2 minutes or so would be not so much to look backward, which is a wonderful thing to do and which we've all been doing very wonderfully today, but maybe to look a little bit more at the present and even the future in certain respects. I've been thinking a lot about, and I see it a lot in the job market right now, what you might call machine learning or statistical learning, broadly defined. Without a doubt, it's all the rage in econometrics and statistics and computer science and the interface, as you all know. And machine learning means a lot of things to a lot of people, but ultimately what it's all about is what I would call predictive modeling. It's all about prediction, good prediction, honest prediction, evaluating and refining predictions. And really, that's what Larry was all about in many respects. Of course, Larry, like machine learning, was about many, many things, and you don't want to try to pigeonhole things too much. but without a doubt, he had a feeling for prediction and how to specify and estimate and evaluate predictive models. He always kept his eye on the prize. And in many, many respects, he foreshadowed what's going on in modern machine learning. Modern machine learning has exactly that perspective. And effectively, at the end of the day, it's all about projections or regressions or conditional expectations. And that's what Larry was always after. And, you know, the modern machine learning is all about things like high dimensionality and incorporating prior information or extraneous information and blending it with models. Well, again, that's what Larry's about. That's what modern machine learning is all about. Larry liked big models, of course, and he had a lot of reasons for that. He wanted to be ready to address a coal mining strike in West Virginia, you know, if and when one broke out. And it just wasn't adequate to try to build a model on the fly. He needed to have it ready. So Larry was all about high dimensions. He was all about incorporating extraneous and prior information to sort of regularize models, whether it be through exclusion restrictions or whether it be through, you know, constant adjustments or whatever you want to call it, Bayesian model averaging, things like that. So I think in very, very real ways, you know, Larry was not only a great, great man of 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and zero econometrics, but he was really a great man moving forward. His legacy is very, very much there in terms of high dimensionality and predictive environments and how to get things right in those environments. So again, thank you, Larry, and thank you all for having me.
Thank you very much. Jerry Berman, please.
Professor Castillo, Professor Berman is coming.
He's coming?
Yeah, let me, let's see, my phone is on. Yeah.
Yes, it's coming.
I have two brief comments. One is we lost Joaquin Vial. We gave him the wrong address, and those who were with us at 8 o'clock know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to go on to explain. And unfortunately, he joined later, and I guess he got involved in something else. So my apologies to you, and in the answers of Joaquin. We are going to invite also, I will ask Adolfo to invite Giselle Guzman, who happened to be the last PhD student of Professor Klein. So after Professor Berman, who is one of those deaths that I have in life, wouldn't be not for him, I wouldn't be, I would have not gotten my PhD. So I apologize for the interruption.
Jerry has the floor. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm still active on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania and have teaching obligations, and just got through with one of those obligations. So I'm sorry I took a break during this presentation, during this overall conference. Thanks to Juan Rafael and others for organizing it. I'm supposed to reflect on memories. I remember a very cold day in Chicago when it was minus 30 degrees centigrade in December 30th, 1994, at the American Economic Association annual meetings. I was about to leave to Bangkok to get more data for my thesis on that last day of the meetings when I thankfully got an invitation to be interviewed by the University of Pennsylvania, and went to the university in what in those days was small smoke-filled hotel rooms of a sort that are no longer permitted. And that's where I first met Laurie Klein, as well as Dick Easterlin, Irv Kravis, and Al Phillips, three other prominent members of the department. And I remember even for that first meeting, the combination of a humorous twinkle in Klein's eyes as he tried to make me feel comfortable in answering various questions, and very good questions about what my econometric intentions were with the data I was going to get in Bangkok. I left the meeting, got on a plane. It was 50 degrees centigrade warmer in Bangkok, and in those days, the most reliable means of communication was a telex, and Laurie was the chair of the department, and I very thankfully got a telex from him in a few weeks, very brief, making an offer to join the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania. I thankfully also had some other telex from other places. I asked my advisor, Frank Fisher at MIT, about these alternatives, and the primary part of his response was to say that Laurie Klein would be a great colleague, a great mentor, and I should take the Penn offer. And I followed that advice, went to Penn, showed up the next year, and I actually had some macro econometric activities in those days, although later I switched much more to empirical micro kind of studies. And among those, I worked with Juan Rafael on a quarterly econometric model of Panama. All of that was facilitated greatly by what was then called the Economic Research Unit, which Klein had established, and which many of us young faculty members, also graduate students, Tom Cooley, Peter Gottschalk, others benefited. And even though I did not keep involved in those activities to the extent as many others, including some of you did, I never was, so to speak, a linkette. I never attended a link meeting outside of Philadelphia. I benefited very definitely from the support through the Economic Research Unit. And more broadly, early in today's events, a lot of emphasis was put upon Klein's scholarly contributions and on his personality, his willing to be very helpful, particularly to younger scholars. A third dimension that was mentioned implicitly, but I think was very important, was he was an academic entrepreneur in establishing fruitful institutions. Among those were LINC, were RIFA, but also from the point of view of someone who's been in the department now for 50 some years. Institutions that have still benefit the economics department at Penn, in particular, the International Economic Review and the Penn Institute for Economic Research, both of which carry on in the department a legacy that Klein played a major role in establishing. And so in that sense, his legacy lives on in the department in important ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Gigi has the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm Giselle Guzman, probably new to some of you. I've been around in the sphere of everything with links for many years. I went with Dr. Klein to, I think it was maybe the 2004 link meetings at the UN. I have the distinct privilege of being Dr. Klein's very last PhD student. I just made it in under the wire. And, but I knew him for a long time. So I actually started working with him at WIFA. And at WIFA, I basically took their business from the old phone books, which was how they would deliver the information, to electronic distribution. And so I did all these deals with, you know, Bloomberg and all these other data providers. And we were always slicing and dicing and mixing and matching and making new data, new models. One of the fun things that I got to work with Dr. Klein on was an asset allocation model where we combined some of WIFA's economic forecasts with earnings estimates. I had to get earnings estimates data, and then we were combining everything, and we had a client we sold it to. And that gave me a chance to work with Dr. Klein directly, and he was telling me, get a PhD, you should get a PhD. I had just done my undergrad at Columbia in economics. And I said, oh no, you know, that'll take way too long. I don't have the time, I can't do it. And so I went and I did an MBA instead at Wharton. And when I got there, I kind of realized that the MBA curriculum wasn't exactly what I was looking for. And Dr. Klein, in his infinite wisdom, you know, I went to him and I said, oh, you know, I think maybe you were right. And he said, that's okay. I saved a special project just for you. And that sort of changed everything. And so I had private lessons with him for 2 years during the MBA program. And we were developing quantitative ways to measure and put into models things like human emotion. And it was a lot of work. It was a lot of fun. And I think the thing that sticks out to me most was his use of metaphors. So whenever there was some concept, you know, that I was having trouble with, or some equations or something that looked like it was just too much, he would always come up with some type of a metaphor. And I remember autoregressive integrated moving averages, he said, think of it like memories and echoes. And then when he broke it down into memories and echoes, it all made sense. And it was just so generous and so wonderful the way he, you know, taught me kind of one-on-one. And I had this immense privilege of spending all this time with him. And then, of course, once that happened, you know, I was sort of hooked, and I got a chance to work also with Suleiman Osmajur on the high frequency yield curve model that he did with Klein, and I helped him get data for it, and, you know, just a wonderful experience. And from there, you know, then I went to Columbia and continued my work with Dr. Klein. I was just very lucky to have him continue to be an influence. I finished my PhD with Joe Stiglitz as well. But every time Klein would come to New York, I would volunteer because I wanted to have at least 10 minutes in a taxi ride with him to have him just tell me some story. So I would say, Dr. Klein, you know, anytime you come to New York, I'll come get you. And so I used to go to Penn Station and pick him up, and he would go to meetings to W.P. Carey or whatever meetings, you know, he was going to. And I would always make sure that I was there to pick him up so that, number one, I could make sure he got to where he wanted to go, but number two, that I could just have, you know, 10 minutes with him and say, Dr. Klein, tell me a story, you know, any story. And so he would tell me all these great stories about, you know, Tinbergen and Kuznets, and when he worked with George Katona on the University of Michigan surveys. And it was just such a wonderful experience. And he was such a humble and a brilliant man. And I really treasure those that time that I had with him. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you very much. Juan Rafael, we are almost set in time, in terms of time, but I would like to say a few words myself. Can I?
Please do.
You know, I made a mistake at the beginning, but I was going to say, and I say now, that I am very happy to meet so many good lifelong friends. Really happy to meet them again. I would like to say just a few words in honor of Laurie Klein. As a matter of fact, some memories and 3 short remarks. In terms of memory, I would say that I met Laurie Klein in 1969. It's a long time. It was through Abel Bertrand del Rio, and from the very beginning, I had a deep entry in World Econometric Forecasting Associate, and I learned a lot from that experience. You know, after coming back to Spain in 1977, I organized an international conference on econometric models and econometric forecasting, and I invited Laurie, Jerry Adams, and Abel Bertrand del Rio. You know, we enjoy a lot, and as a matter of fact, Sonia and Klein and Abel, Jerry had to leave, but they spent a few weeks in Spain, and we enjoy a lot. Believe me, that we had really good time. We took advantage of the meeting in order to organize and to launch a project for building the first econometric of the Spanish economy. 2 groups were created at that time, one in Madrid and the other one in Philadelphia. And a few years later, we launched our services, economic forecasting. It was in 1981. And you know, it was, we create a center and still is doing that. Julian Perez, who joined us in the meeting, who is now in the meeting, is the director of the FEPRE that has been running rather well since that year. The year after, you know, is amazing because at the time of our second meeting, Klein and a number of other economists from WIFA came over all together to our meeting. It was amazing because we needed that. You know, they had a meeting of WIFA, an international meeting in Paris, and they decided to come over. Laurie decided to come over and was a complete success at that time. You know, the following thing I would like to mention is that in 1980, the same year of the Nobel Prize, we had named him as Doctor Honoris Causa of the University Autónoma of Madrid. I don't have time to explain you all what happened, but he was in Stockholm and he decided to maintain 2 meetings, one in Genoa with Carlos Dada and Prometea, and the other one in Madrid for the doctoral degree. It's amazing because you know, it's difficult to explain to you. You know, a big snowstorm took place the same day that he was going to come. Air controllers strike. You know, we figured out how to bring him over here because the whole university was prepared. And finally, he was able to do it. He was named Doctor Honoris Causa at the University of Madrid. In 1983, I joined the Project Ring, and I have been related to it until the very end, as you well know. I would like to mention the 2 meetings that we organized in Madrid. one in Spain, one in Madrid, and the other one in Salamanca. Many of you came over to Salamanca. It was a very nice meeting, and we enjoy a lot over there. After the meeting, coming to Madrid, we invited Sonia and Lori, Barbara and Peter, and Edith and Bert Hitman to come over our house, and we enjoy a lot. At that time, my children were still very young, but we enjoyed there. A big picture was taken, which is now in a very important place in my home. In 2012, at the end, we visited him in the residency in Philadelphia. We went, Bobby Mariano and his wife, and my wife and myself. It was very nice meeting, although Sonia was very sick and Larry was a bit out of his mind, you know, but was perfect. The meeting 1 year before he passes away. As for the three remarks I would like to say, they are the following. One, friendship. Lori and Sonia were our great friends. They were almost like a family. My wife and I love them very much, let me tell you that. Second, in terms of teaching me, you know, Larry was a great economist, not just an econometrician, as you know, and you have said, many of you have said, but for me was a professor, a teacher, and a mentor. As you know, before becoming an economist, I was an engineer. I started being an engineer, and I was very interested in engineering. But I was able to become a professional economist with a lot of effort and a lot of time, because it's not a matter, as you know, it's not a matter of studying economics. It's a matter of becoming a professional. Why Lori was very helpful to me, and every small question that I posed to him, and he explained me all kind of topic and always answer me masterfully. I would say that was great in that respect. The third one is in terms of innovation, creativity. He was an innovator. Not just all that we know about economic forecasting, building models, creating the project link, you know, extending the activity of modeling all over the world, making a big project out of that activity. But of course, being active until he was 87 or 88, that is amazing. But after that, he was a promoter of the high frequency modeling. You know, we have heard already Solomon, Alfredo Coutinho, all of them, and Bobby Mariano, they were related to that activity. For me, that's a great experience. You know, he was able to do the same that he did for macroeconometric models. He was able to do the same with high frequency. You know, if I always have thought that he had lived longer, he would surely have paid attention to the big data and Google Analytics. Not because this activity has much to do with microeconomic forecasting, but because it is a special and new field for the action of a statistician and econometrician. For all of that, please, let me say that, let me reiterate my profound gratitude to Lawrence Klein, and I remember him with great affection and friendship. And finally, allow me to extend, we are celebrating the centennial year of Lawrence Klein, but let me extend my gratitude to Peter Foley for the many years taking care of the project link in spite of having other responsibility. And of course, my gratitude to Juan Rafael because he has been always worried and doing the most for the project link, for the project link meeting. Thank you very much.
Now, Professor Mariano with the closing words. And at the end, after he talks, I'm going to make the last try for the picture that I have prepared. I'll just make one try after Mariano. And if not, that will be it. Thank you again to everyone. Please, Professor Mariano.
Okay, thanks, Juan Rafael. I'll be brief. This is indeed a uniquely wonderful opportunity to touch base with friends and colleagues from all over the world to celebrate Lawrence Robert Klein's 100th birthday anniversary. This is especially memorable and poignant for all of us here present who have had the good fortune of having worked and interacted with Laurie Klein, as we know him, as our mentor, colleague, and friend. The testimonies in today's proceedings, coupled with my numerous personal interactions with him since 1971, when I joined the University of Pennsylvania, highlight the recurring thought that we will always remember. Paraphrasing Peter Pauly, Lawrence Klein is not just an academic giant in economics and econometrics, but also a caring colleague who generously drew and trained scholars from all over the world to his community of researchers through his academic excellence and his concern and respect for the personalities and diverse backgrounds of every individual that he interacted with. This is indeed an enduring legacy to Laurie Klein's lifelong commitment to share his knowledge and mentor students and younger colleagues from all over the world. Once more, many thanks to the University of Costa Rica and to Juan Rafael. Thanks, everyone. It's good seeing everybody. Juan Rafael, it's all yours.
Microphone. Juan Rafael, microphone.
Thank you. Let me see if I can have the picture share.
É que nós redimimos até o último momento. Para nós é importante.
Well, it seems like I'm couldn't make it either this time. In any case, on the name of the university, my chairperson, Cristina Araya, who support this effort, and to all of you, I think it was Carl Weinberg who said it, that the homage to his legacy is yourselves. Together in all the things that you do. So in the name of the university and all the colleagues, my thanks to the support I got from the department, and thank you everyone. Thanks a lot, and I won't be here 100 years from now. So thank you again.
Okay. See you.
Bye to all.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you very much again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Peter, Carlos Dada, everybody. Bye. Ignacio Visco, all of them.
Bye, Adolfo.
Bye, Juan Rafael.
Bye, thank you.
It was so nice to meet you all.
Peter.